The ledger hit the table so hard the oil lamp swayed, throwing shadows across Robert Shepard's face like accusations he could not outrun. 7 days. Harlan Voss set his thick fingers flat on the open page, the red ink column screaming failure even in the amber light. You have 7 days, Shepard, or I foreclose on every acre your father bled to build. I am not a charitable institution, and I have been patient long enough. Robert did not flinch, but inside his chest something cracked along an old fault line. He was 29 years old, standing in the same kitchen where his father had died with a dream still half formed on his lips, and the only thing standing between the broken Spur ranch and total ruin was a week he did not know how to fill. I will make it work, Robert said, his voice low and stripped of everything except the absolute refusal to break in front of this man. Harlan Voss laughed, a short, ugly sound. Your father said those same words, 5 times. He scooped his hat off the peg by the door and looked back once, and the pity in his eyes was somehow worse than the cruelty. 7 days, son, not 8. The door swung shut, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Robert had ever heard. He stood at the table for a long time, his hands braced on the wood, his eyes moving across the columns of debt without really seeing them. The broken Spur sat on 400 acres of Texas hill country. The year was 1878, and cattle prices had been sliding since the end of the great drives north. His father, James Shepard, had borrowed against the land to buy a second herd the year before a drought hit the Llano Estacado and burned the grass down to pale chalk. The herd had survived, but thin. The water had come back, but late. The loan had not forgiven either event. Now James Shepard was in the ground beneath a live oak tree on the eastern ridge, and his son was standing in the kitchen counting the ways a week was not enough. Robert had 40 head of cattle, 12 horses, a bunkhouse with 3 ranch hands who were owed 2 months of wages, and a reputation as a man who worked hard but had never once in his life stepped outside the boundaries of what he already knew. That last fact was about to cost him everything. He did not know that the stagecoach pulling into the town of Harlow, Texas, at 3:30, that same afternoon was carrying the one variable he had never calculated. Eliza Leland descended from the coach the way a woman descends when she has spent the last 4 days in close quarters with strangers and dust, and is done being polite about either. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a livestock broker from Kansas City, who had spent her entire childhood in the company of men who talked cattle and grain and futures markets across dinner tables. She had her mother's dark copper hair pinned severely under a practical hat, her father's sharp green eyes that catalogued a room in 3 seconds flat, and a leather satchel so heavy with business correspondence that the stage driver had grunted when he lifted it. She was also, as of 6 weeks ago, entirely alone in the world. Her father had died of a fever in March, and what he had left her was not money but something more durable. A network of contacts spanning every serious cattle buyer from Kansas City to San Antonio, a reputation by association that opened doors most ranchers could not find with a map, and a mind that had been trained since childhood to look at a struggling operation and see not what it was, but what it could become. She had come to Harlow because her father's final letter had mentioned a ranch in the hill country that had good bones and bad luck, and because the attorney settling his estate had suggested that if she wished to continue in the livestock brokerage business on her own account, she would need to find a partner with land and cattle, and that the broken Spur might be desperate enough to take a chance on her. Eliza Leland did not especially appreciate being described as a chance someone might take. But she had come anyway, because desperation cuts both ways, and she understood that better now than she ever had before. The town of Harlow in the summer of 1878 was not a place that inspired confidence. It had a general store, a saloon with a sagging roof, a telegraph office, a church that had not been painted since Reconstruction, and a population of approximately 300 souls who regarded a woman traveling alone with a satchel full of business papers as either scandalous or amusing, depending on their disposition. The hotel was 2 stories of sun-bleached wood, with a porch that creaked ominously under Eliza's boot heels as she crossed it. She checked in, washed the 4 days of road from her face and hands, ate a meal of beans and salt pork that she refused to complain about, and then spread her father's correspondence across the narrow hotel bed and read it again from the beginning. The Broken Spur Ranch, 400 acres, good water from the Medina River tributary, 40 head of cattle that her father had described as undersized but healthy, 3 hands. Owner 1 Robert Shepard, age 28 at the time of her father's writing, which would make him 29 now. Son of James Shepard, deceased. Debt to the Harlow Savings and Loan held by one Harlan Voss, amount unspecified but characterized by her father's contact in town as ruinous. Her father had written in the margin in his cramped, neat hand, "Good land, bad luck, stubborn owner. Worth a look." Eliza touched the margin note with 2 fingers and felt the familiar hollow ache of grief settle briefly in her chest, before she pushed it aside with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been pushing grief aside for 2 months and could not afford to stop yet. She was up before dawn the next morning, and by the time the town of Harlow was thinking about breakfast, she had already hired a horse from the livery stable and was riding the 7 miles out to the Broken Spur. Robert Shepard was mending fence line on the eastern pasture when he heard a horse approaching, and he straightened up from his crouch with a wariness that had been living between his shoulder blades for the better part of a year. He was a tall man, lean in the way that hard physical work makes a man lean rather than the way hunger does, with sun-darkened skin and brown eyes that had a habit of going very still when he was trying to read a situation. He was wearing a worn canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hands were dirty from the post hole he had been digging, and he was absolutely not prepared for what he saw coming toward him across the yellow grass. The woman rode well, which was the first thing he noticed. She sat the horse with a quiet authority that suggested she had been on horseback since childhood, and she was picking her way through the rough ground with the ease of someone who had read terrain before. She was dressed practically for the weather and the work, in a dark riding skirt and a cream blouse, with the leather satchel he would later come to think of as her weapon of choice slung across one shoulder. She pulled up 6 feet from where he stood and looked at him with those green eyes that missed nothing, and she said without preamble, "You are Robert Shepard. I am Eliza Leland. My father was Franklin Leland of Leland Livestock Brokers in Kansas City. He died in March. I have inherited his business contacts and his book of correspondence, and I have reason to believe you need both. I would like to discuss a business proposition." Robert stared at her for a moment that stretched just long enough to be impolite. "How do you know about my situation?" "Your banker is not as discreet as you would hope," Eliza said pleasantly. "And your father corresponded with mine 2 years ago about the possibility of selling cattle directly to buyers in Kansas City rather than through a middleman. The conversation never went anywhere, but my father kept the letter, and I read every letter he ever kept." She tilted her head slightly. "You have 7 days. The words landed like a second blow from the same fist, and Robert felt something shift behind his eyes. "Who told you that?" "Nobody had to tell me." "Harlan Voss gave your father the same deadline twice. It is a pattern." She swung down from the horse with that same composed efficiency and stood in the yellow grass looking at him with an expression that was not unkind but was absolutely without softness. "May I see the operation? I need to understand what I would be working with before I tell you what I can offer." Robert Shepard had been raised by a man who trusted slowly and spent 30 years paying for the few times he had trusted fast. Every instinct he owned told him to send this woman back to town and solve his problems alone the way he had always tried to solve them. But 7 days was 7 days, and the red ink in the ledger was not going to turn black through stubbornness alone. "Follow me," he said, and turned back toward the ranch house. She walked beside him rather than behind him, which he noticed, and she asked questions about everything she saw with the directness of someone who is not asking to make conversation but because the answers matter. How many head? What weight? What condition? What the grazing looked like in the north pasture versus the south. Whether the water from the tributary had been reliable this season. Whether he had a relationship with any buyers currently, or if he had been selling exclusively through the Harlow stockyard. That last question made him hesitate, and she saw the hesitation the way a hawk sees a movement in the grass. The stockyard, he said. Ned Harker. He takes a 15% commission and pays me whenever it suits him. Eliza's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. 15%, she said, as if she were tasting the words and finding them bitter. That is not a commission. That is a trap. The word landed squarely on something Robert had felt for years but never put language to, and he looked at her more carefully than he had before. They walked the entire property over the course of 3 hours. She asked to see the ledger. He almost refused, and then handed it over because the moment had its own momentum, and he was caught in it. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and her own small notebook beside it, and worked through the numbers with a concentration so complete it was almost eerie. The way a very still animal is more alarming than a loud one. He made coffee on the iron stove and set a cup beside her, and she reached for it without looking up, which somehow felt more intimate than if she had thanked him. When she finally set her pen down and looked at him, she said, "Your herd is undervalued by approximately 30%. Ned Harker has been selling your cattle to a buyer in San Antonio at market rate and keeping the difference above his stated commission. This is not speculation. I recognize the pattern from my father's files." She paused. He had a note about Harker. He called him a hidden liability in the Harlow market. Robert felt the heat of a specific kind of anger, the kind that is half fury and half the sick humiliation of understanding you have been played for a fool. How long? Based on these figures, at least 3 years. She said it gently, which was worse than if she had said it flatly. It is not your fault. He is very good at it, and you had no external reference point. Robert stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the yard and the bunkhouse and the horizon beyond it, and he breathed through the anger until it settled into something he could work with. "What are you proposing?" Eliza Leland opened her leather satchel and laid 6 letters on the kitchen table. "These are correspondence from buyers in Kansas City, Fort Worth, and San Antonio, not Harker's buyer. Real buyers who deal in volume and pay market price without a hidden margin extracted on top. My father built relationships with these men over 30 years. They trusted him completely." She looked at Robert steadily. "By extension, they will trust me. My name carries his word. What I am proposing is this. I arrange direct sale of your current herd and any future surplus at accurate market price. I take a 5% facilitation fee, which is standard and which I will show you in writing as standard. With the difference you recover from what Harker has been stealing, and with the direct sale price, you will clear enough in this single transaction to cover your debt to Harlan Voss with something left over to rebuild on." The kitchen was very quiet. Robert turned from the window and looked at her. "Why," he said, "you could take these letters to any rancher in this county. Why come to a man who is a week from losing everything?" Something moved across Eliza's face, quick as a shadow across open ground, and for just a moment he saw something beneath the composed professional surface. "Because your father was the only rancher who wrote to my father man to man, without condescension, without assumptions. James Shepard wrote to Franklin Leland as an equal who was interested in learning something new." She looked down at the letters on the table. "And because I need a partner who will not try to take the business from me once the deal is done. And a man who is too desperate to be arrogant strikes me as a safer bet than one who is comfortable enough to be both." It was the most honest thing Robert had heard in so long that it took him a moment to absorb it. "You think I would try to take it from you?" "I think most men would." She looked up again. "I am asking whether you are most men." The question sat in the air between them, and Robert was aware, in some part of himself that had nothing to do with business, that this woman was unlike anyone he had ever met, and that the awareness was both inconvenient and absolutely undeniable. "All right," he said. "Show me the letters." They spent the rest of the afternoon at that kitchen table, and by the time the light outside went orange and horizontal, Robert understood more about the cattle market in the Texas Hill Country than he had in 5 years of working it. Eliza explained the networks, the relationships, the way price moved along telegraph lines before it moved along cattle trails, the way a broker's reputation was currency more stable than the dollar. She spoke without vanity, but also without false modesty, laying out what she knew with the clarity of someone who had been taught to respect information and not hoard it. Robert listened the way he did most things that mattered, completely, without interruption, storing every word in some careful interior place. His ranch hands, all 3 of them, Tom Briggs, Jesse Anya, and old Cal Dewart, came in from the day's work around sundown and found their boss sitting across the kitchen table from a woman with copper hair and a satchel full of letters. And the atmosphere in the room was one of concentrated purpose, so intense it was almost visible. Tom raised his eyebrows at Jesse. Jesse shrugged minutely. Cal pretended he saw nothing unusual because Cal had been on the broken spur for 22 years and had learned that James Shepard's son always had reasons, even when they were not immediately apparent. Eliza stood, shook hands with all 3 of them with the directness Robert was already beginning to associate with her, and said she would be back in the morning and they would begin sending telegrams. She rode back to Harlow in the long golden dusk, and Robert watched her go from the porch of the ranch house, and he felt, for the first time in a year, something that was not quite despair. It was, he thought cautiously, the distant outline of something that might eventually be called hope. The next morning she was there before he finished breakfast, which told him something about her discipline and the urgency she felt but would not name directly. She spread a draft telegram on the table beside his coffee and slid it toward him. "Read this before I send it. This is to Marcus Ellery in Fort Worth. He handles medium-volume cattle purchases for 3 packing operations. He trusted my father absolutely and has been waiting for a reliable hill country supplier for 2 years." Robert read the telegram. It was precise and confident without being presumptuous, and it described the broken spurs herd in terms that were honest but framed the quality correctly, not overselling, not underselling, the way someone who understands a market presents a product to someone else who also understands it. "This is good," he said, and meant it. "I know," she said, not arrogantly but simply. She slid 2 more drafts across the table. "These are to Arthur Bend in Kansas City and to George Halloway in San Antonio. George is the one I am most confident about. He and my father were friends for 15 years. He will move quickly." Robert looked at the San Antonio telegram. "You know Halloway personally?" "I met him 4 times as a child and twice as an adult. He sent flowers when my father died." She looked down at the papers and something shifted in her voice, just slightly, for just a moment. "He is a good man." Robert caught the shift and filed it away without comment. They rode to town together to use the telegraph office. And the telegraph operator, a young man named Corey Beale who was constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, looked at the 2 of them with the avid curiosity of someone who has not had interesting news in a week and recognizes it when it walks through his door. Eliza dictated the telegrams herself, and the speed and exactness with which she composed them in real time, adjusting phrasing on the fly with the fluency of someone who had been doing this for years, made Robert revise his estimate of her upward in a way that was rapid and involuntary. They had 3 responses by that afternoon. Marcus Ellery in Fort Worth replied within 2 hours. He was interested. He needed weight and condition details. He could arrange a buying agent in Harlow within 4 days if the terms were right. Arthur Bend replied by evening. He sent his condolences about Franklin Leland and his immediate interest in continuing the relationship with the Leland name, and asked for a price sheet. George Halloway in San Antonio replied last, a longer message, And when Corey Beale read it to them, his voice went slightly reverent because the price Holloway offered per head was 38% above what Ned Harker had been paying Robert Shepard for years. Robert stood very still when he heard the number. Eliza watched him with those green eyes and waited. "That covers the debt," he said quietly. "Just that one sale. With 2 transactions, you build a reserve," she said. "With 3, you start thinking about expansion rather than survival." He turned to look at her directly, and the afternoon light coming through the telegraph office window was doing something to the copper in her hair that he made a deliberate effort not to notice. "You did this in one day." "My father built these relationships over 30 years, she said. "I am only using the door he built. The credit belongs to him." It was the kind of honesty about one's own position that Robert respected enormously, and which was also, he was discovering, a very accurate mirror for his own situation, because everything he had was built on someone else's labor and love, and the recognition of it created a strange kind of kinship between them. They walked back from the telegraph office in the early evening light, and because the situation had its own logic, and because Robert was not a man who ignored logical openings, he said, "You should not ride back to Harlow every morning and back to town every night. The road is rough in the dark and we lose an hour in each direction. I have a spare room in the ranch house that is clean. You would have full privacy. It is a practical suggestion." Eliza considered this for a moment with her head slightly tilted, which he was learning was what she looked like when she was being genuinely thoughtful rather than performing consideration. "It is practical," she agreed. "I will move my things in the morning." She said it without coyness or self-consciousness, and he was grateful for that because he had not wanted it to be strange, and she had not let it be. She moved her things the next morning, and the spare room off the main hallway of the Broken Spur Ranch house, which had been used for storing extra saddle blankets and boxes of correspondence since James Shepard died, became a functional workspace within 2 hours of her arrival, with the leather satchel open on the small desk and her papers organized in a system that was as clear and logical as her mind. That second day, Robert introduced her to the ranch hands properly, and Eliza did something unexpected. She asked Jessie Anya about the grazing conditions in the South pasture in Spanish, which she spoke with the ease of someone who had grown up around the language. And Jessie, who was normally reserved to the point of near silence around anyone he did not know well, answered her in full sentences. She asked Tom Briggs about the weight estimations on the herd, and listened to his answer with complete attention, and wrote down what he said. And Tom, who had a chronic habit of assuming women in ranch contexts were decoration, revised his opinion so visibly that Cal Duart caught Robert's eye across the yard and looked amused for the first time in months. The work of those days had its own urgent rhythm, the rhythm of a countdown. There were telegrams going out and coming back, price negotiations conducted through a medium that stripped language to its essentials, and so demanded that every word carry its full weight. There were conversations at the kitchen table that ran long past when the oil lamp should have been trimmed down, conversations that started with cattle prices and herd management, and gradually, inevitably, moved outward into the broader territories of what each of them was actually trying to build. Robert learned that Eliza had spent 2 years trying to be taken seriously in Kansas City as a broker in her own right before her father's death, and that she had been consistently dismissed not because her knowledge was less than the men around her, but because she was a woman in a room that had decided in advance it did not need to hear from her. He learned that this had not broken her but had done something more complicated, had made her simultaneously tougher and more careful about which battles to choose, had taught her to let her results speak first and her presence follow. Eliza learned that Robert Shepard had not left the Broken Spur in 14 months, not since his father died, that he had been holding the ranch together by sheer force of will and physical labor, and a refusal to accept the possibility of failure that was indistinguishable from the way some people refuse to accept the possibility of grief. She learned that he had been offered a good wage as a foreman on a much larger and more stable operation 3 months ago, and had turned it down without apparently considering it for more than 30 seconds, and that this told her something about him that was either deeply admirable or deeply stubborn or both. It was his land, Robert said on the third evening, when the subject came up sideways through a conversation about expansion plans. They were sitting on the porch in the cooling air, the kind of evening where the sky holds onto its color longer than seems reasonable, and his voice had the careful flatness of someone handling something they are not ready to be emotional about. He put 20 years into it. I was not going to let Voss take it for a debt that was bad luck more than bad judgment. Eliza was quiet for a moment. My father left me the business rather than a brother who expected it, she said. My father's partner's son, a man named Carver, made it very clear he thought the business belonged to him by nature and that I should be grateful to be allowed to assist. My father disagreed. She paused. I think he knew he was not going to recover at the end. The letter he left me was very specific about the contacts and the files and who to trust and who to watch. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a thorough one. She looked out at the horizon. I think he was making sure I could stand on my own ground without anyone's permission. Robert looked at her profile against the darkening sky and felt something in his chest that was complicated and warm and persistent. He sounds like he was a good man, he said. The best I knew, she said simply. The silence that followed was the comfortable kind, which Robert recognized as a significant development from the wary professional quiet of 2 days ago. On the fourth day, Ned Harker came to the Broken Spur. Robert was in the north pasture doing a headcount with Jesse when Tom came out at a near run to tell him, and the tightness in Tom's face said more than his words did. Robert found Ned Harker standing in the yard with his thumbs in his belt, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, who had the easy confidence of someone who had been the only game in town for so long he had forgotten how to be anything else. He was looking at the ranch house, specifically at the window of the spare room where Eliza's lamp was visible, with an expression that was calculating in a way that set something cold and hard in Robert's stomach. Harker turned when he heard Robert's footsteps and smiled the way a man smiles when he is performing friendliness. "Shepard, heard you've had some company this week. Thought I'd ride out and say hello." "Eliza Leland," Robert said, and watched Harker's eyes go still. "Daughter of Franklin Leland, you heard of him." "Can't say I have," Harker said, and the lie was smooth enough that Robert might have believed it once. "Not now." "That's interesting," said Eliza's voice from behind him, and both men turned. She had come out of the house quietly and was standing at the top of the porch steps with the leather satchel in her hand, and the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment and has arranged herself accordingly. "Because my father wrote your name in his notes, Mr. Harker, not in a complimentary context." Harker's smile did not change, but his eyes went to a different kind of still, the kind that means assessment. "I don't know what you think you know, Miss Leland," she said precisely. "And I do not think I know. I have the ledger." She did not gesture at the satchel. She did not need to. "I have 3 years of Broken Spur sale records, and I have the actual market prices from the same periods, and the arithmetic is not complicated." She looked at him with those green eyes that catalogued and judged and found wanting, and she said, "You have been taking approximately $42 per head above your stated commission and keeping it. Over 3 years and across Robert Shepard's sales and at least 4 other ranchers I can identify from the pattern, that is a significant figure." The yard was very quiet. Tom Briggs and Jesse Anya had materialized at the edge of the bunkhouse, and Cal Duart was standing by the water trough, and nobody was pretending not to listen. Harker's smile finally came down, and what was underneath it was harder and uglier. "That is a serious accusation for a woman who has been in this county for 4 days. "It is not an accusation," Eliza said calmly. "It is a conclusion derived from documented evidence." I have already sent copies of the relevant figures to the County Land Office and to the Fort Worth Livestock Association as a matter of record. She paused for a single beat, perfectly timed. I wanted you to know because it seemed only fair. Harker looked at Robert, and there was a threat in the look, the kind that does not need words. Robert held the look without moving, and the thing behind his eyes was cold and completely certain. "We are done doing business with you," Robert said. "We have direct buyers in Fort Worth and San Antonio. You will want to think carefully about whether you wish to pursue the matter of those 4 days' worth of records any further." Harker stood in the yard for another moment, doing the calculation behind his eyes, and then he turned and walked to his horse and rode out, and the broken spur yard let out a collective breath. Robert turned to look at Eliza on the porch steps. She was watching the gate where Harker had gone, and her expression was not triumphant, but it was resolved, the look of someone who has done a necessary thing cleanly. "The copies you sent," Robert said. "You actually sent them, or was that I sent them yesterday," she said. "Before I knew he would come. I sent them because it was the right thing to do regardless." She finally looked at him, and something in her face was less composed than usual, not fragile but alive in a way that reminded him she was not just a professional engine, but a person who had been carrying a weight of anger about injustice for a long time and had just set some of it down. "Your father deserved better than what Harker gave him. So did the other ranchers." Robert stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her, and the afternoon was bright and warm, and the yard was full of horses, and the smell of grass, and the faint sound of the water in the tributary running over its stones, and he thought that there were moments when you understood something about a person so completely and so suddenly that it rearranged something inside you, and this was one of them. He said, "Thank you." It was not enough, and he knew it, and she seemed to know he knew it, because she nodded once, with a brevity that somehow contained everything that did not need to be said. That evening, the cattle buyer from Fort Worth, Marcus Ellery's agent, a young, careful man named Davis who wore spectacles and carried his own scale weights, arrived in Harlow and sent word to the ranch. Robert and Eliza rode in together the next morning for the preliminary meeting, and Eliza handled the negotiation with a fluency that Robert watched with something between admiration and a specific kind of wonder that was becoming harder to classify as professional. She knew the language of it in a way that was native rather than learned. She knew when to push and when to step back, when to let a number sit in the air between two people until the silence did the work, when to introduce a competing offer not as a threat but as a simple fact of the marketplace. She got Ellery's agent to a price that was 14% above his opening offer and made him feel somehow that this was entirely reasonable and that he had arrived at it himself. Riding back to the ranch in the warm afternoon, Robert said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "I sat in on every negotiation my father conducted from the time I was 8 years old," she said. "He believed I should learn the work if I was going to inherit the work. My mother disagreed. She wanted me educated in music and French." She glanced at him sideways. "I can play the piano, but I have never found it as useful." Robert laughed, which surprised them both. It was a genuine laugh, unguarded, and it changed his face entirely, the seriousness dissolving for a moment into something younger and lighter, and Eliza looked at him with an expression she quickly composed back into neutrality, but not quite quickly enough. The 5th day George Holloway arrived from San Antonio himself, which was not expected, and which said a great deal about how much he had trusted Franklin Leland. He was a large, unhurried man in his 50s, with the look of someone who has spent a lifetime making good decisions and knows that patience is the infrastructure of good decisions. He embraced Eliza with a warmth that was paternal and genuine, and held her at arm's length and looked at her and said, "You look like your father when you are thinking hard, which is to say you look like you are always thinking hard." Eliza's composure wavered for a moment in a way Robert had not seen before. "He would have liked knowing you came," she said quietly. "He would have liked knowing his daughter is running his shop better than he did," Holloway said, and then turned to Robert with the clear attention of a man who evaluates quickly and trusts his evaluation. "Shepard, your father's pasture management was better than any small operation I saw in this region. I am told the land has held its quality." "It has," Robert said. "Come see it." They spent the better part of that day walking the land and the herd with George Holloway, and Robert found himself talking about the ranch differently than he usually did, not as a problem to be solved or a debt to be covered, but as a place that had qualities and a future, and the difference was partly Holloway's manner of engaged attention and partly, he realized, the way Eliza asked her questions alongside his answers, so that the two of them were building the picture together, rather than him presenting it alone. Holloway's offer came over dinner at the ranch house, where Eliza had somehow produced a meal that was considerably better than anything the Broken Spur kitchen had generated in months, and where Cal Duart had washed his face without being asked, which Robert noted as a sign of unusual circumstances. The offer was excellent. It was not just a one-time purchase but a standing arrangement. Holloway would take first option on any cattle the Broken Spur sold, at market rate adjusted quarterly, with a handshake agreement to be formalized in writing by his attorney within the month. "This does not make you a middleman, Miss Leland," Holloway said to Eliza. "I am dealing with Shepard directly. But your facilitation is worth recognizing." He slid a second sheet across the table. "This is a consulting arrangement. 5% of any transaction I conduct in the Hill Country through your referral. I believe your father would have appreciated the symmetry." Eliza looked at the paper for a moment, and Robert saw her throat move as she swallowed something that was not food. "He would have," she said, and her voice was steady but only just. Robert watched her recover herself with that quiet, efficient determination he had come to recognize and respect deeply, and he felt, sitting at his father's table with the oil lamp burning, and a future suddenly visible where there had been only a wall, that the particular kind of gratitude he felt toward this woman was occupying the same space inside him as something else entirely, something that had no name yet but that was warm and specific, and not going anywhere. George Holloway stayed the night in the spare room that had become Eliza's office, and Eliza moved her papers to the kitchen table, and late that night Robert found her there when he came for water, sitting in the lamplight with one of her father's letters in her hand. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she did not hear him, and she was not reading the letter so much as holding it, her hand flat on the paper the way a person presses a hand to something that cannot press back. Her face in the lamplight was quiet and young, and exhausted in a way she never allowed it to be when anyone was watching. He cleared his throat gently so as not to startle her, and she looked up and blinked once, and then composed herself with that speed he was no longer surprised by. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not know you were still awake." "Don't apologize," he said, and came the rest of the way into the kitchen and sat across the table from her without asking if she wanted company, because he had the instinct that asking would give her an exit she would take out of habit rather than because she wanted it. He set a glass of water on the table between them. "Is that from him?" She looked at the letter in her hand. "The last one. He wrote it 3 weeks before he died, I think. The date is unclear. He says," she stopped, started again, "he says he hopes I do not forget that the work is not the whole of life. That was not like him. He was not given to that kind of statement." She looked up at Robert. "I think he was frightened at the end that I had become too much like him and not enough like her. Your mother. She died when I was 12. She was not a business person. She was warm and she liked music and she laughed at things that were not especially funny because she believed laughter was its own kind of generosity." Eliza looked at the letter again. "I used to think I had taken after him. Now I wonder if she was the braver one." Robert was quiet for a moment. Outside the ranch house the night was very still, the kind of Texas stillness that is not empty but full of insects and the distant sound of the tributary and the breathing of horses in the pasture. "My father used to say that the land does not care what you think about it," he said. "It just needs to be tended. I think he meant it as practical advice, and I received it that way. But now I think he might have also meant that love works the same way. It does not require you to understand it. It requires you to show up and tend it. Eliza looked at him across the table with an expression he could not fully read, which was unusual because he was developing a very good working knowledge of her expressions. That is a thoughtful thing to say. I have been accused of that on occasion, he said, and she almost smiled, which was better than a full smile would have been from anyone else. On the 6th day, Robert Shepard sent his payment to Harlan Voss, not the full debt. 90% of it, with a letter written in Robert's own hand, explaining that the remaining 10% would arrive within 30 days from the proceeds of the first cattle sale, with documentation of the sale arrangement attached. He wrote it sitting at the kitchen table where his father had sat across from Harlan Voss, and said the words "I will make it work" 5 separate times, and the writing of it felt like closing a door that had been swinging open in the wind for years. Eliza was in the yard talking with George Halloway when he came out with the letter, and Halloway looked at the envelope in Robert's hand and said, "That the Voss debt?" And when Robert said yes, Halloway nodded the way a man nods when he sees something end the right way. "Your father would be pleased," he said, and said it to both of them. Halloway left that afternoon, taking the road back to San Antonio with a handshake that meant more than most contracts Robert had seen, and the ranch settled back into itself with a different quality of quiet than it had held before, a quiet that was not anxious but expectant. Robert spent the late afternoon doing the ordinary work of the ranch, the kind that does not stop for crises or resolutions, and Eliza sat on the porch steps in the afternoon shade and wrote letters in her neat, rapid hand, follow-up correspondence to Fort Worth and Kansas City, the careful maintenance of the network that she was now, unmistakably, running in her own right. He came in from the barn at sundown and she was still on the porch, but the letters were done and she was simply sitting, watching the last light move across the hill country in the particular way it does in June in Texas, which is gaudy and magnificent and not apologetic about either quality. He sat on the top step beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a while neither of them said anything. "What will you do?" he said eventually, after the 7th day. She did not answer immediately. "I had planned," she said carefully, "to establish a brokerage office in a town with telegraph access and enough ranchers in the surrounding area to make the work sustainable. I had been thinking Fort Worth or possibly San Antonio. Those are both large towns," he said. "Yes." Another pause. "There is a telegraph office in Harlow," he said. Eliza turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and the distance between them was suddenly very explicitly not a business distance, and both of them understood that they were no longer negotiating anything that had to do with cattle. "There is," she said. "The spare room would not be adequate for a proper office," he said, "but the main room could be reconfigured. There is a building in town, the one beside the general store, that Harker will presumably not be needing." Something in Eliza's composure softened in a way that had nothing to do with business, a small undoing, like a careful knot that has been loosened by patient hands. "That is a practical observation," she said, and her voice had a different quality than it had carried in all the professional precision of the preceding 6 days. "I have been accused of that," he said, which was a deliberate echo of what she had said about him the night before, and she caught it, and the almost smile became an actual one, and it transformed her face in a way that hit him somewhere behind the sternum with a clarity that was physical as well as emotional. "Robert," she said, and the use of his name without preamble felt like a particular kind of permission, "I am not a woman who does things halfway." "I know," he said. "I have watched you for 6 days. Which means that if I stay," she paused, and the pause contained the whole territory of what was being said and not said. "It would not be as a business partner only," he said. "No, I would not ask that of you, and I could not offer it as if it were all I wanted because it is not all I want." He looked at her steadily, the way he looked at things that mattered, the way he looked at fence line and water quality and the sky before weather, with the complete attention of a person for whom the true assessment of a thing is more important than the comfortable one. What I want is considerably more complicated than that, and considerably more important to me, and I understand entirely if you need time, or if you have reasons I cannot see for why the answer would be no. Eliza Leland looked at him for a long moment in the last light, and what was in her face was not the professional composure or the private grief or the focused intelligence she had deployed in different combinations across 6 days, but something that felt like the sum of all of those things, like a person who has been presenting selected facets, finally turning to show the whole. "I am 26 years old," she said, "and I have spent the last 8 years being told that what I wanted was not appropriate or practical or possible. My father believed I could do the work. He never quite believed I could have the rest as well." She stopped. "I do not intend to repeat his mistake about that." Robert's hand moved the small distance across the porch step and covered hers, and she turned her hand under his and held it, and it was the simplest possible thing, and it was enormous. They sat there in the last light of the 6th day with their hands linked on the porch step of the Broken Spur Ranch, and the hill country spread out around them gold and quiet, and the night came on slowly, and neither of them moved to go inside. The 7th day arrived with a particular quality of morning light that Robert would remember for the rest of his life, clear and sharp, with a freshness in the air that spoke of good weather ahead. He was up before dawn from a habit that would not be overruled by emotion, but when he came into the kitchen to start the coffee he found Eliza already there, the stove already lit, the coffee already beginning its fragrance in the kitchen air, and she was at the table with a fresh sheet of paper and a pen, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that was simply direct and warm and asked for nothing. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said, and stood for a moment in the ordinary miracle of it. He rode to Harlow that morning alone and delivered the letter to Harlan Voss in person. Voss opened the envelope in front of him and read the figures and looked at the documentation attached, the buyer agreements, the sale arrangements, the structure of the new operation laid out in Eliza's clear, precise hand, and something moved across Voss's face that Robert chose to read generously as something close to respect. "Your father would be surprised," Voss said. "My father would be proud," Robert said, because the distinction mattered. He rode back to the Broken Spur in the mid-morning sun, and the landscape of the hill country was rolling and green gold around him, and the Medina tributary caught the light between the cottonwoods and the air smelled of cedar and warm grass, and Robert Shepard rode through it feeling like a man who has been carrying a stone for so long he has forgotten he was carrying it, and then set it down. And the absence of the weight is so remarkable and so right that he wants to stand still in it and pay attention to every second of what it feels like to be free. Eliza was in the north pasture with Jesse Anya when he got back, apparently engaged in a detailed conversation about the nutritional condition of the herd that Jesse was participating in with the full enthusiasm he reserved exclusively for topics he considered worth his time. Tom Briggs intercepted Robert at the gate with a look that was something between a grin and a question. "She going to stay?" Tom asked. "I intend to ask her properly," Robert said. "And stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" said Tom, already walking away. The afternoon passed in the work of the ranch, which had a different character now, not the frantic desperation of the preceding week, but something more sustainable and forward-looking. And Eliza spent a portion of it at the kitchen table drafting the formal letter to the Harlow Town Council about the available building beside the general store, which she had investigated that morning with a thoroughness that had apparently impressed even the council clerk. A woman named Mrs. Patricia Hale, who was not easily impressed by anyone. Dinner that night was the occasion. Not because Robert had planned it as such, though he had in fact asked Cal Duart to contribute his formidable skill with dried beans and salt beef and whatever else was at hand, and Cal had produced a meal that was better than its ingredients had any right to be. Tom and Jesse ate, and then disappeared with a consideration that was so uncharacteristic of their usual habits that Eliza noticed it and gave Robert a sideways look. "They are very suddenly occupied elsewhere," she observed. "They are surprisingly perceptive men," he said. They ate across the kitchen table from each other in the lamplight, and the table that had been a workspace for a week of crisis became something else. And they talked the way they had talked every evening of that week, but without the urgency under it, the conversation ranging easily through territory that was no longer strictly professional, their histories and their families, and the shape of what they each wanted. And the picture that emerged was not of two people who had arrived at the same place by coincidence, but of two people who had been, in some sense, oriented toward the same direction for a long time without knowing it. Robert said when the dinner was done and the lamp was burning low, "I told Tom I intended to ask you properly." Eliza set her cup down and looked at him, and her hands were still on the table, and her face was completely open in a way he understood was not her default mode and was therefore a specific and significant gift. "He told me," she said. Robert almost laughed. "Of course he did. He said it with enthusiasm," she said. "He is a better man than he pretends to be." "He is," Robert agreed. He looked at her across the table, and what he felt was so large and so clear that the only appropriate response to it was simplicity. "Eliza, I have known you for 7 days. I understand that is not long enough for most things. It is long enough for me to understand that my life is better with you in it than without, that you are the most capable and most honest and most interesting person I have met in my life, and that the day after tomorrow or the week after next or the year after that, I am going to feel the same way I feel right now." He paused. "I am asking you to stay, not as a business partner, though I hope you will be that as well, as my wife if you are willing. And if you are not, I would ask that you stay anyway, and give me the time to convince you." Eliza was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he could hear everything: the creek, the insects, the horses in the pasture, the lamp burning steadily. "I am willing," she said, and her voice was steady and warm and certain. And when she said it, she reached across the table and took his hand the way she had on the porch. And this time it was not tentative but definitive, the gesture of a person who has decided and is not uncertain about the decision. He stood and came around the table, and she stood as well, and he put his hands on her face gently, the roughened hands of a rancher on the face of a woman who was also, in her own way, toughened by years of difficult work, and he kissed her in the lamplight of his father's kitchen, and it was the beginning of everything that came after. They were married in the Harlow church 6 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in early August, the year 1878, with the sun coming through the windows that had not been painted since Reconstruction, and the congregation consisting of Tom Briggs, Jesse Anya, Cal Dewart, George Halloway, who had made the trip from San Antonio because he said he would not have missed it, Mrs. Patricia Hale from the town council, and approximately 40 other residents of Harlow who came partly because they were curious and partly because an occasion was an occasion, and the hill country in summer does not provide enough of them. Eliza wore a dress that was the color of the sage that grew along the Medina tributary, and she carried a small bunch of the white wildflowers that bloomed at the edge of the north pasture, because she had picked them herself that morning, and did not see any reason to apologize for that. She walked to the front of the church without anyone to escort her because her father was gone, and because she had been walking on her own for 2 years and did not need to pretend otherwise. And Robert watched her come, and the expression on his face was one that Tom Briggs would describe later as the face of a man who cannot quite believe his luck, and has decided to believe it anyway. The words they said to each other were the words of the ceremony, and they were also true. After, in the yard of the church, George Halloway shook Robert's hand and then took Eliza's hands in both of his and said, "Your father always said the best deals were the ones where both sides came away richer than they expected. I think he would have considered this one of those. His eyes were bright. He would have been very happy." Eliza held herself together long enough to thank him, And then Robert was beside her with his arm around her, and she turned into him briefly, her face against his shoulder, and he held her there in the August sun while Harlow stood around them in respectful courtesy. The building beside the general store became the Leland Shepard Livestock Brokerage by the end of August, and Eliza worked it with the full force of her father's network and her own growing reputation. And the telegraph line between Harlow and Fort Worth and San Antonio ran hot with her correspondence. And by October, the Broken Spur was producing revenue that made the ledger Harlan Voss had slapped on the table look like a different document entirely. Ned Harker's practices became a matter of official record with the Fort Worth Livestock Association, and the combined testimony of the 4 ranchers Eliza had identified from the pattern, once they understood that testimony was available and that Eliza would prepare it properly, resulted in Harker's removal from the Harlow stockyard and a lawsuit that he settled quietly and unfavorably that winter. Robert felt no particular satisfaction in this beyond the satisfaction of a thing being set right that had been wrong. Eliza felt something more specific, the particular gratification of having used knowledge as a corrective force, which was what she believed knowledge was fundamentally for. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a good one. Not soft, the hill country is never soft, but productive and quiet in the way that winters are quiet when you are not afraid of them. Robert expanded the herd by 12 head in November, animals he was able to price accurately now because he understood the market in a way he had not before, and the pastures held them well. Eliza developed a working relationship with 2 other ranchers in the county who had been cautiously observing the Broken Spur situation and now wanted access to the same buyer network, and the brokerage grew accordingly. In the evenings, they read. Robert had more books than his hand suggested, a habit from his mother who had believed in reading as a discipline and a comfort, and Eliza contributed her own collection, which ran to practical texts on agriculture and livestock management, alongside several novels that she defended without embarrassment as necessary for the soul. They talked over dinner and talked after it, and they disagreed regularly and productively. And the disagreements had the quality of 2 intelligent people taking different angles on the same question, rather than 2 people competing for authority, which was partly temperamental compatibility and partly a choice they each made consciously. Cal Duart, who had been on the Broken Spur for 22 years, told Tom Briggs in February that the ranch felt like itself again for the first time since James Shepard died, and Tom Briggs said he thought it felt better than that, and Cal considered this and said he supposed that was possible. By spring of 1879, Eliza knew she was expecting their child, and she told Robert one evening on the porch in the last light, which had become their habitual territory for conversations that mattered, sitting on the top step with their shoulders touching in the way they had since the 6th day of knowing each other. She said it simply, the way she said things that were important, and Robert turned to look at her, and his face did what it did when something reached him past all his reserve, opened and became completely itself, and he took her hand and held it and did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing adequate. Then he said, "Are you well?" Because that was the first thing, and she said yes, she was very well, and he said, "Then everything else is as good as it could be." And she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and they sat there in the April evening with the hill country going green around them, and the future was large and visible ahead of them in a way that was not frightening, but was instead the best possible kind of enormous. Their son was born in November of 1879, in the bedroom of the Broken Spur ranch house, and they named him James Franklin Shepard, which was not a difficult decision. He arrived in the early morning with the eastern light coming through the window, and Cal Duart pacing the yard outside, and Tom Briggs sitting on the top porch step with his hat in his hands, because he did not know what to do with himself, and the porch step was where people sat when things were happening. When Robert came to the yard door and said it was a boy and everyone was well, Tom said good, in a voice that was considerably thicker than usual, and Cal said nothing but sat down on the water trough rather suddenly. And Jesse Anya, who had been in the pasture for the entire labor because he could not bring himself to do nothing but could not bring himself to be visible either, appeared from the direction of the north fence and stood at the edge of the yard, and Robert looked at him and nodded. And Jesse made the sign of the cross quietly, and then went back to work, because that was how Jesse managed the things that moved him most. Robert went back inside to where Eliza was lying in the bedroom with their son in her arms, and the morning light was in her copper hair, and she looked exhausted and luminous and absolutely certain in the way she looked when she had arrived at a conclusion that was correct. And he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this child, this person who had not existed yesterday and was undeniably real today. And his son's face was red and crumpled and absolutely serious. And Robert felt the particular gravity of a love that is a different category from anything he had encountered before, deep and wordless and permanent. "Hello, James," he said quietly. Eliza watched him meet his son, and what she felt was large enough that she did not try to contain or analyze it, only held it and let it be. The year that followed was full, the way the years of a working ranch are full, with livestock and weather and the ordinary work of the land and the ongoing work of the brokerage and the extraordinary ordinary work of a child discovering the world. James Shepard was a serious baby and an interested one, which Eliza took as evidence of character and Robert took as evidence that he would be a great deal of work, and both of them were right. He walked at 10 months, which alarmed everyone because the ranch house had not been configured with a walking person of that scale in mind, and he spoke his first clear word at 11 months, which was horse, a fact that delighted Tom Briggs to a degree that was slightly excessive. Eliza continued the brokerage through the first year of James's life with an organizational capacity that Robert continued to find remarkable and that she considered simply what was necessary, because the contacts were there, and the work was there, and she was not the kind of person who put necessary things aside. She brought James to the office in town in a basket for the first 6 months, and then left him with Cal Duard, who turned out to be an unexpectedly gifted and willing caretaker, with a patience for small children that his exterior entirely concealed. George Halloway visited twice that year, and held James with the comfortable ease of a man who has grandchildren, and told Eliza that the brokerage she had built on her father's contacts was already exceeding what her father had done with the same network by the measure that mattered most, which was the quality of trust on both sides. In the spring of 1881, they expanded the herd to 100 head, a number Robert's father had once named as the threshold between a struggling operation and a functioning one. Robert walked the pasture with that number in mind, and thought about his father with a grief that was different now than it had been when Harlan Voss had put the ledger on the table and said 7 days, different because it was no longer laced with failure, and the difference was enormous. He had told Eliza about that grief on a winter evening, carefully, not the way he usually discussed practical things, but the way the porch step had taught him to discuss things that lived below the practical level, and she had listened with the full attention she gave things that mattered and then said, "He made this land. You kept it. You built it into something larger than either of you could have done alone. I think that is what love becomes when it outlives the person you felt it for." Robert had held onto that sentence for a long time afterward, turning it in his mind, and found it true in all the ways he tested it. Jesse Anya left the ranch in the summer of 1881 to marry a woman from a family 40 miles south who ran their own sheep operation, which was a different kind of ranching, but Jesse had apparently assessed the situation and found it worth the change. Robert gave him a proper wage settlement and a good horse, and told him he had been the best hand the Broken Spur had ever employed, which was true, and Eliza gave him a letter of introduction to two buyers she knew in San Antonio, in case the sheep operation needed market access, which Jesse received with the quiet gratitude of someone who had not expected to be seen that clearly and found it meaningful. Tom Briggs stayed, as Tom Briggs would always stay, because the Broken Spur was the only home he had had since he was 17 years old, and some attachments are indistinguishable from the person. He trained the new hand who came in Jesse's place, a young man named Louis Kavanaugh, who was the son of a Mexican mother and an Irish father, and who arrived with excellent horsemanship, a willingness to learn everything, and the particular quality of someone whose circumstances had taught them to work harder than average, because the average would not be enough for them. Eliza hired Louis to do some of the physical delivery work for the brokerage as well, a second income that mattered to him and that she paid at a fair rate without discussion. In the autumn of 1881, Eliza told Robert she was expecting their second child, again on the porch in the evening light, which had become so thoroughly the place of significant announcements that Robert had once said it must be something in the cedar smell, and Eliza had said it was probably just the habit of stopping long enough to say what needed to be said, which was more accurate and somehow more romantic at the same time. Their daughter arrived in May of 1882, in the same bedroom, in the same morning light, and they named her Clara Ruth Shepard, which was Eliza's mother's name and her grandmother's name. And when Robert said it aloud for the first time, the look on Eliza's face was the most unguarded he had ever seen, completely open and swimming with the feeling of it. And he held her and the baby in the morning light, and thought that there was no unit of measurement adequate for what his life had become. James, who was 2.5 and deeply interested in everything, peered at his sister with the grave assessment of a person encountering a new variable and said, "Small," which made Robert laugh hard enough that Eliza shushed him. By 1882, the Broken Spur was running 120 head. The brokerage had 3 satellite relationships with ranchers in 2 adjacent counties, and the building beside the general store had been expanded to include a second office room that Eliza used for client meetings. The Harlow Savings and Loan was under new management, Harlan Voss having retired the previous year, and the note for the Broken Spur's original debt had been retired in full as of January 1880, a date Robert had marked with a quiet satisfaction that he had allowed himself to feel completely. The life of the ranch had its seasons and its demands and its daily texture, and within it the life of Robert and Eliza Shepard had its own seasons and demands and daily texture. The arguments that were the energetic disagreements of 2 specific and strong personalities, the humor that is the private language of people who know each other well enough to be genuinely funny with each other, the comfort that accumulates in the spaces between the significant moments, the ordinary Tuesday evenings and the unremarkable Saturday mornings, and the Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings, which are ultimately what a life is made of, what it is held together by, what makes the significant moments possible by virtue of the support they stand on. Robert had learned over these years to read Eliza the way he read the land, not with the naive assumption that he understood everything, but with the careful attention that notices the small changes that indicate something larger. He knew when she was tired in a way she would not name, knew when the grief for her father surfaced under some otherwise ordinary moment, knew when she was running at the edge of her capacity and needed the afternoon to be quiet rather than filled. He did not always respond to these observations with words, because she was not always a person who wanted words, but he had learned the considerable value of simply being present and attentive without requiring her to explain why she needed either. Eliza had learned to read Robert with equal care, learned that his silences were not distance but processing, that the face he showed the world, steady and contained and competent, was real and was not the whole of him, that underneath it was a person of considerable warmth and feeling who had simply been raised in a landscape, and a tradition that did not reward the open display of either. She had learned that he needed to be asked, sometimes, what he was thinking, not because he was unwilling to say it, but because he had spent his life assuming people were not interested in the internal workings, and needed to be reminded that she was specifically and consistently interested. She asked him regularly, and the answers were always worth asking for. The summer of 1883 was very hot and very dry, and for 3 weeks in August, the hill country had the still white heat of a land remembering its most difficult self. And Robert watched the pastures and the tributary with the measured anxiety of a rancher who has seen drought before, and who has also, now, the infrastructure to manage it differently than before. He moved part of the herd to the better-watered southern pasture, a decision he made after a genuine consultation with Eliza, who brought the perspective of the regional price data to the question, and whose analysis confirmed that moving the animals now was worth the temporary disruption rather than waiting and hoping. They did not lose a single animal that summer. The fall came in green and grateful after the heat, and the October rains came early and the pastures recovered. And the first cold evening of the season, Robert lit a fire in the parlor fireplace, a thing he had not done in the 3 years since his father died, because the parlor had always felt like the room for formal occasions, and formal occasions had not come, and the room had gathered a quality of absence he had not wanted to disturb. Eliza had rearranged the parlor sometime in their second year at the ranch, gently and without announcement, so that it became a room for actual living rather than a museum of something that had been. And the fireplace was part of that, its use a small declaration that the house was for the people in it now. James was there that October evening in 1883, 4 years old, and in possession of an imagination so active it was nearly audible, constructing something with spools of thread and pieces of wood he had assembled from the barn. And Clara was on Eliza's lap being read to from a book of illustrated poems that George Halloway had sent from San Antonio, a gift of such specific thoughtfulness that Eliza had written him a letter of 3 pages in return. And Robert was in the chair across from them with the ranch accounts, which were now a pleasure rather than a terror to look at, and the fire was burning and the lamp was lit, and the Texas night was outside with its stars and its silence, and the room held all of them in its warm, irregular light. Robert looked up from the accounts and across the room at his wife, who was reading to his daughter with her copper hair loose around her shoulders and the firelight in it, and she felt his gaze and looked up. And across the ordinary space of the parlor, they looked at each other with the full recognition of 2 people who know each other deeply and completely, and who find, on looking, that what they see is still the thing they chose. Eliza's mouth curved and her eyes held what they always held when she looked at him, which was the combination of warmth and intelligence and specific tender feeling that was entirely hers and entirely for him. And Robert's face did what it always did under her look, opened quietly, became fully itself. "The accounts good?" she asked. "The accounts are very good," he said. "I know," she said, which was not arrogance but simply the statement of a fact she had a hand in, and he smiled, and she returned to the poem, and James looked up from his construction to ask about something entirely unrelated, and the evening went on being what it was. 3 years after that, in the spring of 1886, Tom Briggs announced that he intended to marry Mrs. Patricia Hale, who had been the town council clerk at the time of Eliza's arrival in Harlow, and who had clearly been watching Tom Briggs with increasing assessment for some years, and had apparently concluded that the assessment was favorable. Tom made this announcement at breakfast one morning with the defiant embarrassment of a man who expects to be teased, and has decided to endure it as quickly as possible. And Robert said, with complete sincerity, that he was glad and that Patricia Hale was a fine person. And Eliza said that she had seen this coming for 2 years, and had not said anything because it was not her business, which made Tom look at her with the expression of a person who is both confirmed and slightly unnerved. Their wedding was in November, and the broken spur provided the celebration, which Eliza organized with the same efficient thoroughness she brought to everything, and which resulted in the best event the town of Harlow had hosted in memory, the kind of celebration that becomes the benchmark against which subsequent celebrations are measured. Lewis Cavanaugh, by this point well established on the ranch and trusted completely by both Robert and Eliza, was given the title of ranch foreman that year, and accepted it with a gravity that indicated how much it meant to him. Robert shook his hand and said he had earned it, and Eliza added that the raise in wages would appear in the first pay envelope after the September cattle sale, which made Lewis's composure momentarily uncertain in a way that was touching. The brokerage continued to grow. By 1886, Eliza had facilitated sales for 11 separate ranching operations in the Hill Country and 2 counties north, and her name had the same quality her father's name had once had, the quality of a word that opens doors. She had been offered a partnership with an established brokerage in Fort Worth twice, and had declined both times without extensive deliberation, because the broken spur was home and Harlow was home, and the network she had built was rooted in the specific place and the specific relationships of this specific landscape. And she had not survived 2 years of Kansas City dismissal to hand her business to someone else's structure now that it was worth taking. She wrote this approximately in a letter to George Halloway, who had been the intermediary for the second Fort Worth offer, and who received her refusal with the combination of respect and relief of a man who had hoped she would stay, but had felt obligated to relay the offer honestly. James Shepard started school in Harlow in the fall of 1885. A fact that Robert and Eliza both found simultaneously obvious and startling in the way of all childhood milestones. He was a serious and curious student who took after both of them in different measures, and who demonstrated at the age of 6 a particular gift for arithmetic that made Eliza look at him, sometimes with the pleased expression of someone recognizing a characteristic they were not expecting to see reflected. Clara was fiercer, louder, and considerably more difficult to contain, and was extremely clear from a very young age about what she wanted and what she was not going to accept, traits that Eliza regarded with straight-faced appreciation and Robert regarded with the loving resignation of a man who recognizes the specific kind of formidable he has produced. By 1887, the broken spur was running 180 head, and the land that had been 400 acres at the time of Harlan Voss's 7-day ultimatum had been expanded by a careful purchase of the 60 acres to the north that had been owned by an elderly rancher, who was moving to live with his daughter in San Antonio, and who sold to Robert at a fair price, and with a handshake that was as binding as any document. The 460 acres was different from the original 400 in the way that something built is different from something inherited. Both were true. Both mattered. The land that James Shepard had bled to build was still there, was the foundation, was the reason Robert had refused to let Voss take it. And the land that Robert and Eliza had built on that foundation was the reason the foundation survived. In the late summer of 1887, 9 years after Eliza Leland had stepped off the stagecoach in Harlow, Texas, with a heavy leather satchel and her father's network and her own formidable mind, she sat in the Harlow office of the Leland Shepard livestock brokerage with the latest correspondence spread across her desk, and the afternoon light coming through the window that she had replaced with a proper glass 3 years ago, and she wrote a letter to Arthur Bend in Kansas City, who had been a contact since the first week and was now a reliable friend. She wrote about the year's cattle sales and the brokerage's figures and the expansion of the broken spur, and at the end, in the way she had developed of including the personal alongside the professional because her father had done this and she had understood eventually that the personal was what made the professional durable, she wrote, "My son James is 8 years old and has begun to help with the accounts in the evenings and is better at it than I was at his age, which I find both delightful and humbling." My daughter Clara is 6 and has announced that she intends to own the largest herd in Texas by the time she is 30, a statement which her father received with the expression he reserves for ambitions he believes are entirely feasible, and which I received with the full expectation that she is not wrong. We are well, all 4 of us. The land is well. I think my father would have found it satisfactory. She stopped, and the afternoon was quiet around her, and she thought about her father with the grief that was now the clean grief of someone who has been given time and circumstance to carry it properly, the grief that does not hinder but simply persists as a form of love. Then she finished the letter, sealed it, and carried it to the telegraph office herself, and on the way back she stopped at the Broken Spur office in town, which was what they called the street-level space Robert used for the administrative side of the ranch when he came to town, and he was there at the small desk with the quarterly figures, and he looked up when she came in with his usual expression, the one that was simply glad to see her, uncomplicated and specific. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He stood and she came to him, and he put his arms around her in the quiet of the afternoon office, and she let herself be held for a moment in the way she allowed only with him, completely, without the professional composure or the organized exterior, just herself in the arms of the person who knew her best and whose love was as reliable as the Medina tributary and as strong as the ground under the Broken Spur pastures. "The figures are good," he said into her hair. "They are always good," she said. "I know," he said, deliberately echoing her own words back to her the way he had learned she liked, and she laughed against his shoulder. They walked home to the ranch together in the afternoon, taking the longer road that went past the live oak tree on the eastern ridge, under which James Shepard was buried with a stone that Robert had placed there himself the year after his father died. They stopped there, the way they sometimes did, not always with words but with the pause of people who remember and want to mark the remembering. Robert stood at the stone and looked at it and thought about 7 days and about ledgers with red ink, and about the morning a woman had ridden across the yellow grass toward him with a leather satchel and a question, and how the answer to the question had been the answer to everything else as well. Eliza stood beside him and touched his arm, and he covered her hand with his, and the live oak moved in the evening air above them, and the hill country spread out in all directions green and golden and permanent, and the Broken Spur was visible below them from the ridge, the ranch house and the bunkhouse and the barn, and the pastures running out to the tributary, where the water caught the light between the cottonwoods, and the smoke beginning from the chimney where Cal Duart or Lewis Cavanaugh or possibly James himself, who had been enlisted into kitchen responsibilities with the serious enthusiasm he brought to everything, was starting the supper fire. He would have liked her, Robert said. He did like her, Eliza said. He wrote the letter. He kept her father's name. He was always looking further ahead than I gave him credit for, Robert said. That is what good fathers do, Eliza said, and there was in her voice the warmth of a woman who has been a daughter to a good father and who is watching her husband be a good father in turn, and the entire weight of what that means was present in the sentence without requiring elaboration. They stood there together in the late light until the first star appeared above the ridge, and then they went home, down the hill and across the pasture, and through the gate with its iron letter S that James Shepard had hung 30 years ago, and the door of the ranch house opened from inside where their children were, and the light spilled out onto the porch where important things had been decided, and the evening welcomed them. The Broken Spur was not just surviving. It had never just been surviving, not in the way it had looked from the outside, not in the week of red ink and deadlines and the long shadow of debt. From inside it had always been something more than the sum of its difficulties, had always been the land and the work and the people who gave it their whole attention and their whole lives. And now it was all of that, and also the life that Robert and Eliza Shepard had built on it together, which was large and warm and fully inhabited, and which would outlast them in the best possible way, in their children, and in the quality of what they had made. The year 1887 moved toward its close, and the broken spur moved into it as it moved into all things steadily, with the confidence of something rooted deeply in good ground.